Evening, everyone. Don't worry about coming in while I'm talking. I'm like the adverts before the main event. Good evening, everybody. And my name is Mark Ledbury. I'm the director of the Power Institute here at the University of Sydney. And it's a real pleasure to introduce tonight's lecturer and our speaker. But before I do that, I'd like to acknowledge that we're all here on Gadigal land never ceded. And I wish to pay my respects to the Gadigal people and their custodianship of these lands, to elders past, present, and emerging, and indeed to all those First Nations people here today. Our history at Power, and indeed at the Uni, is a very short one and indebted to the millennia of teaching, understanding, and cultural transmission on this site and on many others like it across Australia. So it's a real delight to introduce McKenzie tonight. McKenzie Wark is Professor of Media and Culture at Eugene Lang College at the New School in New York. But I suppose we could also call her a hometown girl of sorts, born in Newcastle and having studied extensively here at UTS and at Macquarie, and of course at Murdoch too. Mackenzie's been, since the 1990s, a cultural thinker and writer of acuity, of punch, and of particular prescience, as well as of, as you know, huge influence. Already in the 1990s, she was grappling with the global media and the concept of the virtual here in Australia and globally, in virtual geography and in the virtual republic. And as net culture developed, she analysed its effects in Australia, gave us tools to explore it in, for example, celebrities, culture, and cyberspace, made us think vectors, and gave us the information proletariat, analysing the threat of bad information as political strategy, prescience. After her move to the States in 2000, I believe, her restless intellect and formal experimentation gave us the collective work Speed Factory, the GPS-enabled dispositions, and we, of course, then got the Hacker Manifesto, 2004, a profoundly influential analysis of, among other things, hacking in the expanded field, the possibilities of a hacker mentality, the corporatization of the gesture of the hack, and in particular a dire and prescient warning about the vectoralist class that wages an intensive struggle to dispossess hackers of their intellectual property. More prescience. A restless and polemic intellect, Mackenzie's combination of astute 21st century post-Marxism, situationist sensibility, maybe we could call it, and wide-ranging cultural engagement across environmentalist, gaming, and other cultures, then gave us a series of texts across a number of fields, including the experimental gamer theory, and I'll have to skip quite a number of them, but I just want to I think those, especially dwelling on situationism, and those of us into that absolutely love those books. But I think 3 inquiries into media and mediation, it's very important work in 2013 with Alexander Galloway and Eugene Thacker, which sort of ranged through Bataille and Van Eyck, and again seemed to have its finger on a certain cultural pulse, arguing that communication defines itself negatively by the noise the communicants struggle to exclude. And we had, such memorable lines as capitalism is a communicable disease in the form of a disease of communication. And then, as you will know, Mackenzie's scholarly and creative energies in the decades since have ranged to the Anthropocene, to thinkers that might help us in the 21st century, across 2 books, The 21 Thinkers of the 21st Century and then Sensoria. And a period of intense writing preceded Mackenzie's transition, and that transition has had impacts and resonances culturally which have been explored very recently in Reverse Cowgirl, and most recently in Love and Money, Sex and Death, 2023, which you will know well is an epistolary account, a very moving one, personal and political, of a life and a transition. And Raving, about which Mackenzie has been speaking with students on this visit here, but about which she spoke and was part of our Image Complex series, convened by Nick Croggan a year or so back. And in fact, I take this opportunity to thank Nick, who's been so instrumental in facilitating Mackenzie's trip here in Sydney and in doing so much else. You can hear that talk, by the way, along with all of our talks on our website. Sorry, here comes the spruik, powerinstitute.org.au. Don't forget to sign up to our mailing list if you haven't already. We're definitely here for the ideas. But tonight's lecture, Mackenzie's going to address, again, our current moment and our future more generally, and her talk tonight is entitled Post-Cultural Studies. I hope it's still entitled that. There will be time for questions after the talk, and so many of you here and so many people who know McKenzie and her work so well, we expect there'll be a number. So please join me in welcoming McKenzie Wark.
Ooh, what just happened? Phew, made that go away. Well, thank you. And yeah, my thanks to all of you for coming on a rainy Sydney afternoon. And my thanks to my hosts. It's a pleasure to be back in what's sort of my hometown. All right, let me get into it. Yes, it is called post-culture and post-cultural studies. It's been a long while since I've spent much time in Australia. In the late 90s, I fell in love with a New Yorker. In 2000, I left Sydney to live there and fell in love with New York. When I left, my work was mostly in the then emerging field of Australian cultural studies. There wasn't much call for that in America, so I had to reinvent myself. As a provincial outsider with few connections and no prestige credentials, it was always going to be a career on the periphery, but as such, more fun. I have no regrets about any of that. Today I want to talk a little bit about some recent work in the context of how it grew out of an early participation in Australian cultural studies, and not quite the same thing, cultural studies in Australia. So the first book I published after emigrating was A Hacker Manifesto, and in that I argued that we might be witnessing a mutation in the commodity form that exceeds the explanatory categories that Marx laid down in Capital, but which are fully explicable if we take a step back to Marx's earlier contribution to the critique of political economy. In other words, the proper object of Marx's thought is not capitalism, but modes of production, of which capitalism is just one. Analysis should proceed from the ensemble of the forces and relations of production, the economic base, to the legal, political, and cultural, or, if you prefer, ideological superstructures. Now, a great deal of mischief resulted from Georg Lukács' contention that the capitalist version of the commodity form has come to saturate the whole social totality. And it was clear in his own time, at least everyone else, that there were at least two articulated modes of production: capitalism, in which capitalists exploited workers, and an agrarian economy in which landlords exploited peasants. And how easily we forget that much of Marx's theory was once concerned about the peasant question. It was clear also in the writings of W.B. Du Bois or C.L.R. James that the modern world was also a product of interactions with a third mode of production, the slave economies of the New World. Given that there's often been multiple articulated modes of production in the past, it seemed reasonable to me 25 years ago, and even more so now, to imagine that a new mode of production could have emerged, articulated with capitalism and other modes. What made this emerging mode of production possible was the development of the forces and relations of production, a kind of perfectly vulgar Marxist thesis. In particular, the emergence of information as a techniques and legal forms of recognition of information as private property created a new kind of class relation between creators of information, I call them a hacker class, and those who come to own and exploit its value, which are called a vectoralist class, who, moreover, come to control the whole value chain through owning and controlling information vectors, stocks, and flows. The thesis of A Hacker Manifesto actually came out of my Australian experiences in several ways. Before I landed my first academic job, I worked in magazine publishing. I saw firsthand how the means of production were changing because of digital technologies. And this made me question the move common in cultural studies of severing the textual surface of culture from the vector of its production and distribution. And my first book, Virtual Geography, tried to conceptualize the space and time within which global media events occurred as shaped by the vectors of telegraphy, telephony, and telecommunication. So the textual and the vectoral are, for me, actually complementary modes of analysis. And in my second book, Virtual Republic, my concern was whether the overcoming of the tyranny of distance in communication posed problems for the space of an Australian national culture and polity, and hence for the social democratic project of its reform. Was an Australian culture possible? And if it isn't, then maybe an Australian Republican polity is not possible either. So this was the 90s. The Murdoch press was busy importing American culture wars. The internet had not yet swallowed up every other media vector. The internet was still a place for play, on the edges at least. I was engaged with avant-garde movements that tried to create a radical politics, theory, and art out of the kinds of cheap and quick connections the internet of the 90s afforded. As it happened, that was the work that resonated when I got to New York and started hunting for jobs. By the early 2000s, it was clear that, like all the avant-gardes before it, my friends and I had lost the war for the future of media and culture. The internet would be big business. As a companion to a hacker manifesto, I wrote Gamer Theory. The way subjectivity is produced by contemporary media seems to me to have a game-like quality. Thinking about games as a material, media form seemed more productive, for me at least, for thinking about what happened to culture than talking about neoliberalism. Not being a philosophical idealist, I don't think the shape of everyday life actually comes from economic theory. So in the world of cultural studies, as I learned it in the 80s and 90s, there were two main schools of thought, Frankfurt School and Birmingham School. This, of course, oversimplifies things, but it's sort of clarifying. The Frankfurt approach, building on Lukács, stresses the way the commodity form permeates and deforms all of culture. And the Birmingham approach, building on Antonio Gramsci, stresses the way that the working class and other subordinated people can create forms of collective agency within culture all the same. And in those terms, A Hacker Manifesto was my Birmingham book, and Gamer Theory is my Frankfurt book. I'm not putting myself on the same level, but it's like standing on the shoulders of those giants, if you will. But both, I think, were engaged more with the culture of the present than with the archive. It's easy to make the present look like the past, as if capital is eternal. It's also easy to overstate novelty and see the present without connection to the past. The hardest thing is to track the tendency of the way the totality and history are experienced in everyday life as subtly moving. And one way to do that is to play with language, to draw it intentionally out of past traditions, but to mutate it just enough to catch the tension within historical time as it's lived. Sometimes to understand the present, the past needs to be read over again, which was the project of my work on the Situations International, one of the more intriguing of the post-war avant-gardes. And that work of mine's just been brought together and republished as Leaving the 20th Century. What I think I appreciated about the Situationists was that they had both a critique of the totality, theory of the spectacle, and a series of practices for attempting to invent, as they called it, another city for another life. They fused Marxist and avant-garde approaches. They were interested in contemporary media and urbanism as their side of operation. There was a lot to learn there, I felt. Well, that one's blank. What happened to that? Cut that out later. Australian cultural studies, as I experienced it coming up in the 90s, tended to centre the culture as text rather than media as vector, and was interested in more popular than avant-garde artifacts, and had moved away from Marx to Foucault and Lyotard and Deleuze and others, all of which seemed at the time necessary to refresh the conceptual armature and defamiliarize the surface of the cultural given. But I still at the same time felt a little bit out of step with some of those moves. I'd come up through media production, so the techniques of culture mattered to me. And while I was deeply interested in Australian cinema and television and popular music, I was also connected to the emerging media vector through experimental digital music writing and image making. Sometimes I wonder how that melange would have worked out if I'd stayed here. In Australia, I had access to something like a national public sphere. I had a column in the Australian newspaper. I was a lapsed Marxist in the pay of Rupert Murdoch. I made radio for ABC Radio National. These were things that were within reach of a middle-class white boy from Newcastle who'd gone to state schools. In America, none of that was possible. There I was just another provincial chancer. So in New York, I worked more with transnational digital avant-gardes. it wasn't a bad vantage point from which to develop a practice of learning from avant-garde subcultures and bohemias, and developing a conceptual language for what could be gathered from those milieux as practices. This goes all the way back to my undergraduate days at Macquarie University in the 80s. I was supposed to be studying law. That's another alternate timeline. It's like, what if I'd become a lawyer? But then I took the criminology class in law school with Gil Boehringer, one of my most influential teachers. He took a radical, critical approach to criminology and what was, I kid you not, called the sociology of deviance. This helped me realize that what criminology was about was policing people like my friends. Many of my friends were gay, illegal at the time, let's not forget, or drug users, or lived in nightlife, or the squats, or bohemia. We were the deviants. So my entry into cultural studies was through the sociology of deviance and what people like Paul Willis, Angela McRobbie, and in particular Dick Hebdige did to it. And I was particularly influenced by Dick Hebdige coming to Australia courtesy of the Power Institute. So thank you, Power, that actually kind of changed my life. So Willis and Angela McRobbie and Hebdige, they took the lives of policed populations seriously as having agency and even an aesthetic. And I took that into my work on hackers, gamers, and more recently, ravers. The connection to so-called deviance was personal as well as political and academic. I tried and failed at being a gay man 3 times. It took me a while to figure out I was transsexual. It wasn't easy to find the language, the community, the means to be a trans woman in the 80s or 90s. Besides, something was more important to me, and that was writing. So my nationality, my sexuality, my gender, my politics is writer. I had to become a writer first. I came out very late as transsexual, and it was actually my 3rd transition. The first was becoming a writer. The second was becoming a New Yorker, and the 3rd was coming out as trans. Those transitions were possible and related because each time I was able to find a culture within which I could dwell. As a New Yorker, as a transsexual, I felt like I had to give back something to both those milieux, and I attempt to do that as a writer. And this leads me to recent work. I want to talk about my book Raving, but first, When Monsters Speak, a Susan Stryker reader, of which I was the editor. Susan Stryker and I are exact contemporaries, both born in 1961, so we're 49. But she came out in the 90s and survived as an out trans woman, and that's a rare feat. In the past, and too often still, we've not often had the chance to live long lives. The work of hers that I really like are these early pieces that came out of the emerging queer bohemia of San Francisco in the 90s. She was connected to the BDSM world and wrote about it beautifully. She's a brilliant exponent of auto theory. When Monsters Speak starts with her 90s auto theory text, because I wanted to highlight that work, before moving on to a sort of set pieces which deal in a more academic fashion with the border wars between an emerging trans studies, politics, culture, and queer studies, feminism, and history as a discipline, and so on. The thing you have to remember about trans studies is queer theory is more like a frenemy than a friend, and there's work still to do on that. So what I want to contribute to trans life is to return the gift. I want to do that through a little sort of thickening of the fibers of our culture. We've been around a long time and always had a culture, but it can be hard to find and hard to sustain. There's a lot of different kinds of trans people. The one closest to my heart at the center of the Venn diagram of trans as a subculture, a bohemia, and as an avant-garde. A bit over 10 years ago now, there was a spike in the visibility of trans people. It's now referred to as the trans tipping point. As trans people of color pointed out at the time, this is going to be a double-edged sword. Visibility helped us find each other, helps us come out, make community. It also makes us a target. People who are in the business of hating everybody, not like themselves, suddenly learned about a whole new minority that they had forgot to hate. And they have really doubled down to catching up on lost time. Having studied how moral panics about deviant, quote-unquote, subcultures happen, how culture wars happen, none of this sort of actually surprised me. My own work, and for that matter, visibility, always aims to fly just under the radar. One learns not to respond to the enemy lest one form an identity solely against what opposes it. One of the signs of the post-cultural is actually the culture wars. It's only through aggressively opposing an other that a semblance of a culture might come to exist. So for trans people, finding ways to appear to each other while not appearing as the bad object of a culture war is a difficult art. One's survival and what I'll shortly define as a post-cultural landscape calls for oblique strategies, some of which I learned from the Brooklyn queer and trans rave scene, which is the subject of my book, Raving. This is a subculture, a bohemia, or perhaps an avant-garde whose media strategy is selective visibility. One has to work one's way in, develop relationships, trust, to kind of find the good stuff. Having read Dick Hebdige or Guy Debord or Susan Stryker will help you get a handle on it, but it's not like a 60s avant-garde or a 70s subculture or a 90s bohemia. The transformation of the media vector and the emergence of a distinctive kind of information political economy changed the possibilities for culture, making it a much more fugitive thing, to use a term I borrowed from Fred Moten. So Raving became my New York book, my love letter to the city. It's maybe a strange place to end up applying what I learned from Australian cultural studies, but here we are. Who said Australian cultural studies was only applicable to Australian culture? There's more than a little Megan Morris and Stephen Mukey in that little book. To name just two of my informal teachers. Raving was not my first book in the first person. I've been interested for a long time in the appearance of the first person, not so much in academic writing as in writing that makes the eye a node in a field of concept and affect. Somewhere between auto-theory and auto-fiction is what I'd call the auto-textual. And here are the sort of American writers have been central to that for me, would be Audre Lorde, Gloria Anzaldúa, Leslie Feinberg, and of course Susan Stryker herself. So how can a marked subject, marked by race, sexuality, transsexuality, connect the particulars of everyday life to the totality of history? So what do I mean by marked subject? Well, the marked subject is marked for death. It has to attempt to make itself in and against the practices of subject making, what Louis Althusser called interpolation, that want it dead. Disciplinary powers of the clinic, the prison, push the bodies of marked subjects toward being the objects of expert authority rather than autonomous subjects at all. Marked subjects are marked off from the possibility of becoming subjects as the dominant culture defines valid subjectivity. So the marked subject can be spoken about by others in the third person, but is not always given the space to speak in its own voice in the first person. Marked subjects, if they are to survive, have to collectively create their own means of making a life and making sense of a life. They have to make a practice of what I'm going to call selving. What interested me in Susan Stryker was precisely these acts of self-making as practiced by trans women, but practiced together. I had need of those arts myself, and I think maybe we now all have need of a pedagogy about how to make a self, about practices of selving, precisely because the contemporary media vector robs practically everybody of the means to autonomously produce ourselves. We could all learn something from those who always had to become selves collectively together outside the dominant forms of validated existence. So how do we end up with a generalized condition that we could call post-cultural? And here I have to sort of jump in scale from the study of everyday life back to the analysis of mode of production. The theoretical writings of Pier Paolo Pasolini come in handy here, and actually more useful than Althusser, I gotta say, in retrospect. What in the 60s he called neo-capitalism was a regime that made not just consumer products, but extruded consuming subjects out of the same techniques. The cultural superstructures were ceasing to matter. Subjects extrude directly out of the economic base. The language of culture became a technical language. Now, Pasolini's pessimism seems close to the Frankfurt School, but there's a crucial difference. It's not the essence of the commodity form that permeates and damages culture. It's an historically specific techniques of the era of mass production and consumption. It's a historical thesis rather than a philosophical one. And it's a useful counterpoint then to the Birmingham approach, which stressed the agency of subaltern subjects in and against what in Pasolini's terms would be neo-capitalism. Another useful tension here is between Pasolini and the Italian autonomist Marxists, where British cultural studies stressed the agency of the working class outside of work and culture. The Italians stressed agency at work and extended that to the concept of agency in and against the social factory. This comes, of course, from a very different level of self-composition of the working class in both those countries. My undergraduate honours thesis at Macquarie, by the way, compared British cultural studies and autonomist Marxism. I got a 2-1 for it, which is why I didn't get a PhD scholarship to study at Power Institute and went to do an MA at UNSW instead. At UTS, as it's now called. Yeah. Worked out. In the autonomous perspective, the agency of the working class is the historical driver and capital is reactive. Capital's innovations are attempts to outflank or contain the working class and put off again and again the possibility of the working class's self-valorization. I think that's essentially right, but incomplete. The autonomists and their French interlocutors of the journal Multitude tried to account for the mutation in the mode of production with a series of sort of conceptual modifiers. They talk about material and immaterial labor, or industrial and cognitive capitalism. So they're sort of making language, using the binary of language kind of thing to try to understand tendency. This way of thinking earned a rebuke from Paul Preciado. To a bunch of cishet men, this might look like cognitive capitalism that exploits immaterial labor, but to a transsexual, it looks like a pharmacopornographic regime that exploits potentia guadini. All right, I'm going to translate that. What Paul is saying is, we could understand the contemporary ensemble of the mode of production through the production of pills and porn, and we could send a Hugh Hefner rather than Henry Ford as the sort of archetype of the era immediately before ours. So it's the exploitation of the orgasmic potential of the flesh via a techniques. Not coincidentally, Preciado arrives at that analysis in a sort of brilliant work of auto theory, centering the trans experience of selving. An information economy runs on pills and porn, hooked into drives rather than desires, might be one definition of the post-cultural. The leap not even Preciado or the Italians wanted to make is to think that all this might point towards an emergent mode of production that's not even capitalism anymore, it's something worse. One in development for many decades, but which took a turn somewhere between the early 2000s, when I wrote a Hacker Manifesto, to the end of the 2010s, when I wrote Capital is Dead, to sort of revise the thesis of that earlier book. And the shape it took responded to subaltern pressure and invention from below. So I still think subaltern agency drove this mutation in particular directions, but it also then drove an intra-ruling class feud where a different ruling class ended up on top, which I've called the vectorless class. Back in the 90s, developments in information technology, whether meant to make office work more productive or as consumer toys, started to reduce the price of storing, transmitting, and modifying information. On the production side, it enabled a spatial disaggregation of the sites of material production and the production of the information that managed it. The offices could stay in the global north, but the production could move to the global south. This would disrupt the power of organized labor at a time of stalled productivity. So-called neoliberalism as an economic ideology and set of policy prescriptions is in effect not a cause of this development, whose origins lie more in the development of the forces of production as pushed by pressure by subaltern classes, by working classes. On the consumption side, the means for processing information at home, whether for work or play, develop rapidly, and with the unintended effect of making the free distribution of information much easier. Information partially escaped the property form, and some of us in the digital avant-garde actively encourage the development of this information commons. And as I wrote in a Hacker Manifesto, information wants to be free, but is everywhere in chains. Now, the ruling class response was twofold. Firstly, as Cory Doctorow has shown, to embed the constraints of so-called intellectual property directly into information technology at the cost of considerable breaches in privacy. So we now have North Korea levels of surveillance, but its origins were to stop us sharing stuff. The second development was more interesting. It tried to treat the information commons as an input for commodification that an emerging ruling class could exploit for free. The commons was recuperated at a higher level of abstraction, hence the rise of a business model that accumulates information in large aggregates from what it calls users in exchange for providing morsels of information to those users, interlaced, of course, with advertising. The vectorless mode of production is built on asymmetries of information. So you go on your device, it gives you a little morsel, but somebody else got all of the information in the aggregate and are able to extract from you, even when you're not working, which is the weird part. Yeah, like just walking down the street with a phone in your pocket, you're producing information and hence value for someone, even though you're not working. How do you figure that? That we are no longer interpolated as subjects, but extruded as users, was perhaps the sign of a post-cultural turn all along. The category of the subject, it should be said, is always already ideological. A theory of ideology does not treat the concept of subject as itself ideological, kind of remains ideological. It's my problem with Althusser. The same goes for the concept of user, which presupposes that what is used is of use and has, in Marxist terms, use value. The user is what is produced by vectoral techniques based on seizing attention and holding it through automated repetition based on what's known from information extracted from a particular user and users in general. The production of the user is automated. In this sense, so-called AI has been around for a while. AI has been making us its users for some time. The latest developments further exploit the commons by simulating the production of more of it. Capitalism took the knowledge embedded in the hands of the craft worker, broke the work down into steps and automated the steps as discrete, simple actions. That's what a production line does. It turns labor into sameness. Vectoralism had to take a different approach to automate the production of difference, which is what art, science, culture, learning, the hacker class are all about. Producers of difference as a class, the hacker class, have been under pressure from many directions to reduce our bargaining power and our right to the work we produce. The fantasy of so-called AI is to automate the production of difference. The only problem being that most of what it produces turns out to be shit. One hesitates to make predictions, but I suspect that the AI bubble will burst, but that nevertheless it's here to stay and will eliminate whole categories of hacker employment and also be used as a strategy to reduce the bargaining power of the hacker class or creative workers. The post-cultural is a landscape in which users are directly produced out of a techniques that manufactures both information that seeks attention and the attention it garners in an automated feedback loop. Two strategies, one reactive and the other more creative, respond to the anxiety of oneself becoming automated. And one is to hoist a sense of interiority into existence against an external threat. The threat can be racially othered, can be trans people, or your local library or school. Supposedly liberal-minded people often rely on this same structure of opposition to appear to exist. The other strategy is a bit more subtle. It's not about the designated outsider whose othering produces the sense of a coherent self belonging to a coherent community. Rather, it's about fields of anomalies, each of which is anomalous to each other. And to do that, it's often best to get offline, or rather to use the online space for the purposes of creating discrete spaces nested into it, but opaque to it. And that's what I've learned from both transsexuals and from ravers. In the post-cultural, what becomes of cultural studies? I think one has to shift perspective from the study of culture as something presumed to exist to the teaching of practices to bring culture into existence. In the gap on the post-cultural surface, where machines produce users, to attempt to interrupt the circuit of user production and open a space for a play of bodies and their sensibilities together, that they might make something else. I wouldn't think of this as an avant-garde anymore. We might be done with that military metaphor in an everyday life so thoroughly militarized, so thoroughly oh God, I can't quite say that word. In an everyday life so thoroughly militarized. I think of it rather as cultivating deserters, those discreetly taking their leave of the post-cultural. Ironically enough, one can automate one's appearance as a user and go off and play with the other deserters. Post-cultural studies, if there is such a thing, is an education in the art of discrete desertion. And I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you obey the first rule of questions, which is put the mic very near your mouth and speak a nice, short, sharp question. That would be perfect. Put your hand up first and Nick will find you, I think.
You know, my whole academic career started because the thing I would always do was ask the first question at events. Recommend it.
Yeah. There's one down here.
What do you think might happen as the result of desertion?
Yeah, that's a good one, and it sort of like points to something and then sort of doesn't say what's there in a way. But to think of desertion, it's not necessarily oppositional or subversive. It's a sort of much quieter kind of withdrawal out of, not a complete withdrawal from visibility, but a withdrawal from having any stake in visibility. And sometimes to leave a decoy up in place is maybe not a bad idea. And then to sort of create, culture, really, in spaces that they don't have to be completely offline. I'm not suggesting we sort of, throw our phones away or whatever, because it's not really possible. But where you might be able to sort of reconfigure one's relation to techniques a little bit selectively to create a corner where culture might still be something that one lives. And then what do I mean by culture? I could have put this in there, but it takes a whole paragraph. But culture as structure of feeling, as a whole way of life, and also culture in that more traditional sense of the best of what was thought and said. There's different senses of it. So it's to sort of begin with thinking maybe it's not even there anymore, but the sort of only the simulation of it. So then how do we go about making that first desert and then go make it? But the tricky thing is maybe to not say too much about it when you find it, because that renders it extractable. And that's the whole ethics and politics of the writing of Raving, is how do I write about this little world that I find that's my culture without being a tourist in it and exposing it to extraction. So one could think further about those instances. I learned a lot about that from Stephen Mukey and Eric Michaels, who did, I think, really interesting, sort of like post-ethnographic, if you'll let me say that, work with Western Desert peoples or people in the Kimberleys, in Stephen's case. Like, how do we change this? And how do we learn from cultures that are actually very good at the role of secrecy and non-sharing as a necessary component in the sustaining of cultures? And Eric's book of Eric's I learned so much from is actually called For a Cultural Future. And I think I've actually started to think implied in that very title is how do you make culture possible?
How does that proliferate if it's so secretive? How does it, well, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's not so much indigenous cultures, as I understand them through Eric particularly, are about maintaining secrecy but also just sort of boundaries of who observes what where and so on. And I'm not an expert on this. This is just my reading of Eric and other writers in that space. Secrecy is maybe not quite the right word, and I might have inappropriately attached it here, but maybe a little bit of Eduardo Glissant's opacity. I'm interested in the word decoy and deserting and ways that you selectively point the way to something so that only those who really want or need to go there will follow you. That's sort of a thing one learns about transculture before the tipping point, and also stuff I think we need to restore to it post. How do you sort of put the marker up for those who need to find where it is, but which not everybody's going to necessarily even notice? So it's not completely secretive in that sense, just a little sort of filtered.
So I'm wondering how we might be able to conduct our own post-cultural studies, because I don't think we really want to, conduct it in this institution. So what kind of tactics or spaces, like, could there be?
Yeah, and maybe one's PhD thesis is the decoy, and the real work is a little bit somewhere else, and it helps if they're closely connected, so you're not doing two completely different projects. That would be insane. But to sort of, and I'm sort of thinking this as I say it a little bit, there was a bit of a tendency to try to bring vernacular practices and language into the university, and I'm not against that. Like, maybe that's a good thing to attempt that. But then can we also think maybe sometimes we would do the opposite and leave those alone, but find ways of producing the sort of decoy version of it that is in a sort of formal academic form. And we'll have breadcrumbs in it for people who need to find their way back to where you got it. But that where we don't have to reveal everything in an institutional setting and keep a little bit on the DL. And it's, again, I'm just thinking out loud, it's a little bit also the difference between the epistemology of the closet and queer theory and the experience of trans people, that, like being decoys and hiding rather than coming out is sort of our whole deal, like that was our whole experience. So like maybe the making public, the making visible is not always the strategy. Like, how is the selective visibility, opacity, ambiguity a set of sort of necessary tactics, Yeah.
Hi, I wonder if there's like a relationship between the kind of more recently talked about phenomenon of quiet quitting, I guess, in the workplace, like kind of decoying out of the work that you're being paid for.
Yeah, and it's not, I can only tell this as an anecdote because it's not my field, but if I get this right, there was sort of this decline in number of strikes. That graph goes down. The graph that goes up is people taking like sickies. So there's sort of like, so people figured out, like a little bit of a ruse for how to sort of get out of work a little bit. I'm a little ambivalent about the whole thing, in that if you're trying to actually run something and get something done, you kind of need people to want to actually do it and work. And some things sort of actually need to be run, and even if not under optimal conditions. So I don't know, maybe we're sort of not quite identifying what the thing is we ought to quit from. Because if your quitting involves making your co-workers do more work in your place, that's not really succeeded. You've sort of done, like harm to the collective being of working people in a way, even if your objective was the boss, So, how do you find where you disaggregate and desert in a way that doesn't mean that somebody else has to do your job for you, which creates division and a lack of solidarity, So yeah, I think that one's a little more subtle than is sometimes sort of presented.
Thank you. So just riffing off that, really interested because you talked about strikes and sickies. Like maybe back in the 20th century, the workplace was a place of solidarity and community. Arguably, capitalism has exploited that by making people feel like their only community is their workplace, which makes them want to come into work all the time. Should we be happy about the fact that people are retreating from that into more individually curated spaces of community, or should we, as you say, regret the fact that we are losing solidarity in the workplace to that?
Yeah, and I have a sort of tendentious response to this, and it's a little bit based on my own workplace experience. Like, working from home is bullshit. Most people are not working at all, and they're just, like faculty meetings on Zoom are just nonsense, Most people just put the blank screen up with their name on it, and then they're off feeding the cat or something, So I kind of feel there's a loss of engagement in the, because the workplace is two things at once, yeah? You're producing use value and exchange value, and it's like, yeah, you produce exchange value and that's exploitable, but if you're producing use value, it's stuff that people actually need, like my students need the university to run, like I need the officers of it to actually respond to those emails and solve problems for students. So yeah, I'm sort of a little bit wary of the complexities of the disengagement from labour. Like maybe it's just sort of like deserting from the wrong thing. Like if you're deserting from the people who need your care or from co-workers, that isn't actually gonna work, and kind of leads to attempts to, do more surveillance in the workplace and replace us with, freaking AI, which make up answers to people's problems for them. So yeah, I think we've maybe sort of not quite thought that one through a little bit.
There's a line in the opening pages of Capital is Dead, which I always love, where you say something like, privacy is a bourgeois issue. The issue is with asymmetry. I was wondering where privacy kind of fits into this, because the destitution that you're articulating is not a privacy, or if it is, it's a privacy against privacy. Like, I wonder where that is situated.
Yeah, I mean, privacy tends to be about the bourgeois subject having a space to retreat from outside of civil life. But where that place is then usually figured as family. In the American context, it also involves church. So those things are hived off from the domain that the state has direct access to. That's complicated because families under the thumb of patriarchs, sometimes you want the state to be able to intervene against that, but that's complicated because states often then make those situations worse. So yeah, like you're sort of caught in between rock and a hard place with some of this stuff, thinking it as privacy. The thing that I'm interested in with the sort of networks of transgender mutual care in New York City or the rave scene is that it's neither public nor private. It isn't either of those things. And I don't think it's really captured by counter-public sphere and concepts like that. It's a little too elusive and slippery. So I'm passing through, not native to nightlife spaces where, people are living somewhere in between public and private at night. It's not visible directly to the public sphere, but it's not retreated into a private space either. So yeah, those sort of interest me as ways to think sort of outside that, sort of formal structure that's sort of embedded in notions of civil society and, that book by Habermas on structural transformation of the public sphere, is that what it's called? yeah, which I didn't think really sort of captured some of where we might want to go with this.
Thank you for your talk tonight. Thanks, McKenzie. I was really struck by your term selving, and I was wondering how that plays out in your work, and maybe sort of leading on from visibility and privacy. How does that make your work feel more embodied, in a sense, now, in the trajectory of your writing?
Yeah, that one showed up in, I was writing Philosophy for Spiders, which is my book that sort of engages with Kathy Acker. And Kathy, you know, it's really clear in the writing, and Kathy wasn't one person, but it was a fairly coherent set of multiple acts of selving that were sort of a little bit in flux. And the way I kind of got a coherent theory out of Kathy's work by not treating it as all coming from one voice. It's not univocal, there's several voices, but they're fairly connected in a network, you know. And try to think it in a way that wouldn't pathologize that, yeah. And that sort of led me to, oh, what if we thought, just sort of did away with thinking category of the subject altogether and thought about selving as practice, that it's still pointing towards interiority and all that, but maybe then if you think it as a practice, you get the body back in the frame, and you sort of think through, yeah, what are the constructions of habits of repetition that, you know, produce a viable form of reflective embodiment in the world, and can we call that selving? And try to, in a non-prescriptive way, help students find how to do it. Because I kind of think, you know, this is just my experience with undergrads, is you sort of got to wind it back a little bit from teaching them, you know, like the book on the syllabus or something, to like, how do you have a relationship between your body and a book? You know, how do you have a relationship between acts of concentration and, you know, staying off your phone or getting the laundry done? You know, like there's a sense of maybe you've got to find ways to teach the art of selving, not as an individual thing, but then also as a kind of practice that you'll share with others and learn with others. That part's missing a little bit too. Which is not to bag out to today's students, you know, like when I was 18, 19, there was just other nonsense that we went through, you know, so it's not a generational criticism, it's just that the problems have actually changed a little bit, and so we maybe need to teach it, maybe need to transform how we teach a little bit to meet that.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering if this idea of the decoy or desertion was influenced by your work on the situationists, and if so, how?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's like, I don't know. So I think, to me, all of the avant-gardes that are interesting are media avant-gardes. They're sort of an aesthetic of organization and an organization of aesthetics. And, you know, we tend to get them hived off into art history and literary history and stuff like that. And it's like, no, I think they're these like collective engagements with the media techniques of their time that attempted this sort of aesthetics of organization and organization of aesthetics. And that always involved a media strategy. And, you know, the futurists announced themselves in what's basically an advertisement on the front page of Le Figaro. And Dada is the art of, you know, sticking it to the bourgeoisie. And the surrealists adopted some of that early on, you know. So there's always sort of a media strategy that was very much about the spark that generated visibility in a kind of challenging, confronting way, and projected itself as in advance. I don't think that worked at a certain point, and the situationists and what some of them did later were pointing in a slightly different direction of an analysis of the entire production of appearances, and then possible ways of withdrawing internally within that. Initially in the service of total revolution, But later, in the interests of survival of something as like an undercurrent, the board never lost the faith that the revolution would come. But in the meantime, who are the devil's party? Like who are working discreetly in a different manner. So I think in situations to sort of like rethought the media engagement of the classic avant-gardes in an interesting way. Then Fluxus did another thing altogether, which was networks that use the postal system, and then that leads to mail art and all of those sorts of experiments, and then that led to the stuff I was involved in the 90s, where we basically did mail art, but we used the internet. So yeah, to me, there's sort of like a series of, the avant-gardes are always right about something, and then it comes true in the most horrible way. And then you just have to move on from wherever, oh God, that ended up being a nightmare. Let's move over here instead and try this other thing. So it's like you're continually darting away. But maybe not forward in advance anymore, but maybe like sideways. Let's sort of desert from it. Maybe that's sort of the strategy now,
Hi McKenzie, thanks for your talk. Thanks for showing the autonomedies in the art textbook. I remember reading that when I was a teenager and it tried my mind. And also the Situationist. So I'm wondering why, I think you said you're a post or perhaps Marxist, why you've moved away from the Situationist scene, which is based on council communism, and the autonomous Marxist of Mario Tronti, grounded in an everyday practice of the working class actually using violence to seize the means of production, where they offered a very practical means and explanation on how to go about doing that. I'm wondering why you now describe yourself as a lapsed or post-Marxist, and moved away maybe from that scene or believing in that heavy-duty kind of stuff where they were serious. Like Ralph Nigan writing in 1975 a manual on how to launch an urban insurrection, which is not trendy, opposed to keeping more societal spectacle and trendy scenes. So I'm wondering why you moved away from that.
Yeah, I don't think I did that much. We lost. We lost. And how do you deal with the defeat of a movement and regroup? And I've really thought that since the 70s. Like I was raised in the milieu of the Australian Communist Party, and everybody knew we'd lost, but were hanging on. Like they wouldn't give up the faith. And I really always wanted to honour that. And I think that tradition was very aware of being implicated in defeats as well, in a way that some other movements are not. So yeah, I don't think I moved that far away from it. And it's always been a kind of object, like a discourse that's moving. Like the Italian autonomists were attempting to recover from the failure of Italian communism, and so it was already a sort of a reformulation and displacement and movement. But I don't think we can stop in 70s, 80s. Like our object is historical; it's changing. So what are the concepts of the contemporary?
Thank you. Good talk. You mentioned that your analysis of your world in New York was inspired by Australian cultural studies. Could you please say a little bit more about that and how you found that productive being positioned from here and there now?
Yeah, the really sort of creative stuff, and my connection to Australian cultural studies is 20 years out of date, so I have to say that. But I was really moved by Vivian Johnson's work on copyright and Aboriginal material. I thought copyright's a bad idea, but it's like, oh wait, it's all of these traditional designs are now on tea towels and no one got paid for it. So like rethinking that. I mentioned Stephen Yuki's work and Eric's work. Formally, I learned a lot from the way Megan Morris writes, and wrote about her. There's one of the chapters of Telesthesia is sort of actually about antipody and theory. Like there's always sort of, it's not dialectical, but there's this sort of like reversal thing going on. And I think there's a formal device I got from her writing. That was really helpful. I think I was at most of the early conferences of Australian Cultural Studies Association. I think I was at the first. I missed one, but I would go to those, and there'd just be all of these different people. Sort of Graham Turner breaking down British cultural studies, and so I just felt like that was the milieu that I learned from, and it matters that it happened a little bit away from University of Sydney, University of Melbourne. It happened out in the second tier. I don't really think that, but like second tier schools, like Griffith was very important in that formation. It started with journals that were sort of self-published, like Feral Publications and Local Consumption, and I was involved with Intervention for a little while. So I just sort of learned from being in that milieu of like, how do you create a movement that's intellectually ambitious, attempting to figure out what the contemporary is, that is going to point in several different directions. And some people had got stellar academic careers out of it, and some people went into cultural policy, and some people made media artifacts, and some of us fled and went to the other side of the world. But I just think that was an intellectual milieu that was very important to me. And it's like, oh, you just get up and do it. Like, you just do it, like people started the Journal of Australian Cultural Studies, which became the Journal of Cultural Studies in a sort of a coup that kicked the Australians out of it. So it's like, oh, okay, so you can just do stuff, but you do it collectively. Like, that was the thing that I learned from that.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm really into your concept of ficting and facting, and I'm just wondering whether you're working on any new fiction writing.
God, I forgot that one. That was like came up, it was like a catalogue essay or something, or a conference, or I have two jobs. Like, I have a full-time academic job, but New York is expensive, so my second job is doing this and writing occasional pieces and stuff, and that was where I got that one. And it's trying to like, what if we thought outside of, fiction and non-fiction? Non-fiction is already a weird term, right? Oh, the stuff that's supposed to be more real is described negatively as not being fiction. Like, English is a weird language. What if we thought of ficting and then facting as practices that are like weirdly implicated in each other and never entirely separable in a way? Was where that one came out. And I haven't actually picked it up again and woven it into other things, but things I forgot, and it probably fits with the autotextual in ways I hadn't even thought about yet. So thank you. I'm like, I could do something with that. Yeah.
Time for a couple of last ones.
McKenzie, thank you. You mentioned that you transitioned later in life, and I was just, because I've been spending all more time on Reddit, because that's what you do, in the forums, answering questions. And the question that came to my mind was, what was the final straw? Or what would you say was the one thing that made you transition? That's very personal, you don't have to answer.
Yeah, it's like, I don't even know, I think. Boredom, maybe? It's just like, I kind of knew really as early as 18, like, this gender thing is nonsense. I don't want to be a man. Like, what the fuck, The only trans women I actually met in the early 80s were streetwalkers, because I parked my car in Premier Lane, which was the Stroll, and they were sitting on my car, and we got chatting, and I would actually park there because it was, I was living in the Cross. Also, I was living in the Cross. Why? And I would talk to them, and but I was kind of afraid of what I was seeing of myself in them, and thinking I couldn't survive that. Like, if that's what would happen, I can't do that. I'm not strong enough, not brave enough. And I'm frankly, just too ambitious. I want to write things and do things. I kind of took the easiest possible, safest possible route, which was stay in the closet and not even think about it for a long time. But at some point, I'm just like, God, I'm so bored with myself. I can't take it anymore, I'm going to come out. And I got a couple of years into that, and then the lockdown happened. So I was like, great, I just sort of got used to being in the world. And now that got taken away. But Yeah, it's, because it just really seemed, and this is still a little bit true, that like the life of trans women tends to be short. Like if you come out early, it's going to be short. If you come out late, it's going to be short because you were something else and there aren't many years left. So I chose the other kind of short life out of, cowardice and whatever. But it does give me a feeling of obligation to a community because a lot of, particularly trans women, but trans people in general, who were of my era, who came out young, are just dead. They're just not here. Like there's this gap, and I was at Queertopia today, and it's a kind of important story, and I cried. It was so moving about centering the generation of gay men that we lost, but we lost trans people too, who are often doing sex work and were often, substance users because their life was so freaking hard, and we lost people, So, I kind of, if I'd come out earlier, I might not be alive, but through cowardice, kept myself, to the point where I could actually finally do it. And the final thing was that it had to be okay with my kids. And it's just like, I had to actually ask them. It's like, I have something very important I have to talk to you about. I think that I'm transgender and I'm going to transition, but, are you going to be okay with this? And they're like, okay. Bless the Zoomers and their, like exposure to stuff on the internet. And it's like, yeah, that's all right. Yeah, that's who you are. My kids still call me dad, which is weird, but I feel like it's a role, It's like I still perform this role of that. And why shouldn't like women be dad if they want, Like, why not if you're doing that work?
Sorry, my single mother was
There you go. Yeah. Yeah.
had to do both.
I think we've reached the end of our questions, and so I just wanted to say, on behalf of this transient community that's been here to listen to you, thank you so much for your generosity. And
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.